U.S. President Donald Trump's 10% tariff on Canadian energy sent shockwaves, raising the question, could Canada and Qatar fill Europe's post-Russian energy void? While the West shunned Moscow, a scramble for alternatives ensued. Qatar, already securing long-term deals, eyed further expansion, but Trump's tariff on Canadian energy ignited a global energy realignment, inadvertently creating a spectacular flip-flop that challenged America's energy position. Even before Washington could react to tariffs on 180 countries, Qatar simultaneously redirected its gas exports towards Europe. Pipelines once destined for the U.S. now eagerly converged on Germany, France, and the U.K., forging new alliances. How will Washington respond to its former allies turning away? Could counter tariffs on Canada and Qatar force Trump to reconsider? Let's explore this in today's video. Subscribe and turn on notifications for updates. In early 2025, Trump's 10% tariff on Canadian crude oil and gas, which accounted for nearly 50% of U.S. imports, up to 4 million barrels daily, triggered an unprecedented energy crisis between the two nations. This move disrupted decades of established rules, hitting U.S. refiners and forcing Ottawa to find new markets for its gas, 90% of which previously went to the U.S. Instead of Texas and Louisiana, Canadian LNG is now flowing to Europe, which saw a 23% surge in LNG imports in Q1 2025. Simultaneously, Qatar, with its low LNG export costs, seized the opportunity, planning an 85% capacity increase by 2030 to boost exports to Europe and Asia. This U.S. tariff shock allowed Qatar to elevate its position, forcing Washington to reassess its energy strategy and alliances. From the initial tariff to global energy realignment, a new geopolitical gamble unfolded. By mid-2025, the full 10% tariff on Canadian gas took effect, a jolt Washington hadn't anticipated. In 2024, Canada exported 8.6 billion cubic feet per day to the U.S., nearly half of U.S. demand. This sudden price hike forced Ottawa towards Europe and Asia, accelerating the LNG Canada project in Kitimat, BC, a 14 million-ton capacity facility with first shipments in mid-2025. This CAD 40 billion pipeline network, capable of carrying 2 billion cubic feet daily, directly links Montney gas fields to export terminals, bypassing the U.S. market. The impact was immediate. Cheap gas to the U.S. shrank, raising eastern state gasoline prices by 40 cents in a month. Experts noted thousands of refinery and port workers felt the strain, with Stellantis alone laying off 4,500 in Windsor due to higher import costs. Canada showed agility, turning crisis into opportunity, while the U.S. faced an energy stability dilemma. What do you think of Trump's decision? Share your comments below. While Canada pivoted, Qatar expanded aggressively. From 77 million tons of LNG in 2024, Doha aims for 142 million by 2030 via the Northfield expansion, potentially commanding 25% of the global market. Qatar proactively signed long-term deals with European giants like Total Energies, 27 years, 3.5 million tons annually to France, and Shell, 27 years, 2 million tons annually to Netherlands, aiming to replace Russian gas. EU LNG demand is surging, the IEA forecasting a 25% increase in 2025. With Russian pipe supply drastically reduced, Europe needs LNG to replenish low storage levels. However, EU environmental rules pose a challenge to Qatar, potentially leading to exemptions or supply threats to maintain its low-cost reputation. Even as the U.S. ramps up LNG exports, infrastructure lags. Industry leaders warned of bottlenecks without more pipelines and ports, delaying significant U.S. capacity increases until 2026 to 2027. Qatar, with the lowest production costs and long-term offers, is capitalizing on this. Washington faces domestic energy security and slight price increases. Qatar is seizing opportunity. Faced with the Ukraine pipeline shutdown, reducing Russia's EU gas share from 40% to under 10%, Europe urgently sought alternatives, signing long-term deals with Canada and Qatar. Brussels prioritized LNG projects, even planning direct investment abroad for stable supply. Canada, via LNG Canada and Qatar, through major contracts, became new energy pillars for the EU. LNG transformed into a diplomatic tool, with Qatar leveraging EU environmental exemptions and Canada its G7 status for favorable terms. LNG now accounts for over 35% of EU gas imports, with the bloc considering a strategic reserve. Meanwhile, U.S. consumers face consequences, with domestic natural gas prices rising nearly 80%, driven by record LNG exports and Trump's tariff. Heating and electricity bills soared in eastern states. Washington's export push strains domestic infrastructure. From the 10% tariff to Canada and Qatar's new energy map, the U.S. faces a dilemma, balancing global interests with domestic well-being. Should Trump reconsider these tariffs? Canada and Qatar simultaneously exploited the LNG opportunity, potentially isolating the U.S. in the global energy market. In 2024, the U.S. held 45% of EU LNG exports. However, in early 2025, Brussels signed long-term deals with Ottawa and Doha, creating a new competitive energy lane. The U.S.'s unilateral tariff backfired. U.S. natural gas futures spiked 8% in March 2025 as record LNG volumes flowed out, raising domestic retail prices. American consumers faced soaring heating and gas prices. Washington was forced to expedite infrastructure expansion and negotiate methane regulation relief in Brussels. LNG became a strategic diplomatic tool, with Qatar leveraging exemptions and Canada its G7 ties for favorable long-term deals. This power shift risks U.S. influence over global gas prices and flows. The future of U.S. energy policy is uncertain. Will Washington continue its hardline stance or pivot towards multilateralism and infrastructure investment? The answer will determine America's role in the new global energy game. After the 10% tariff on Canadian gas, a global energy shock occurred. Instead of a monopoly, Washington triggered a pivot. Ottawa and Doha signed multi-decade EU contracts, filling a 33 billion cubic meter gap and boosting EU LNG imports by 25%, projected 2025. Canada and Qatar became new energy pillars. The tariffs meant to protect Americans backfired, raising domestic gas prices by nearly 80%. U.S. export infrastructure lagged. Canada and Qatar leveraged EU relationships for competitive prices, turning LNG into a diplomatic tool. Washington faces conflicting imperatives, protecting domestic consumers versus global energy leadership. My view is the U.S. should gradually reduce trade barriers with allies like Canada, invest in domestic LNG infrastructure, diversify markets with flexible bilateral deals, and accelerate the clean energy transition using LNG revenues. Only moderate protectionism, robust infrastructure, and cooperation can reverse the U.S.'s trailing position. In today's geostrategic landscape, this is key. What do you think? Leave your comments and subscribe for more analysis.